The air inside the Bitter Creek trading post was thick with the stench of stale tobacco, dried mule sweat, and cheap whiskey. Sunlight cut through the grimy, greasepaper windows in sharp, dusty beams, illuminating a room packed with the dregs of the Arizona borderlands, trappers, deserters, and freight haulers who had long since discarded whatever morality they had brought west. In the center of the room, standing atop a reinforced flour crate, was Sarah. Her calico dress was torn at the shoulder, stiff with the red clay of the territories, and her hair, once a bright chestnut, was matted and dull. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the floorboards. Just 3 weeks ago, she had been part of a wagon train heading toward California. But when a fever broke out, the wagon master discovered the truth she had tried so desperately to hide from the religious community. She was barren, cast out by her late husband's family as a broken vessel, a useless mouth to feed. When the water rations ran low, they had simply cut her loose, leaving her at the mercy of the trail. Mercy, however, was in short supply. Silas Vance, a bloated, scarred trader who smelled of rancid lard, had taken her in only to put her on display like a broken-down pack mule. "Come on, you miserable lot!" Vance bellowed, his voice scraping like gravel. He grabbed Sarah by the chin, forcing her face upward to show her hollow, exhausted eyes to the crowd. "She might not be able to give you a house full of young-uns," the midwife back east stamped her defective, "as you all well know, but she's got a strong back. She can wash, she can cook, and she'll keep your cabin warm when the north wind blows. Do I hear $50? A chorus of coarse laughter erupted from the bar. $50 for a dry well, a mangy Skinner shouted, spitting a dark stream of tobacco juice near Sarah's boots. "I can buy 2 good horses for that, Vance, and they won't talk back." Sarah swallowed hard, her fingernails biting into the palms of her hands until they bled. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. She closed her eyes, praying for a sudden stroke of lightning, an Apache raid, anything to swallow her whole. $20. Vance tried again, his grip tightening on her arm until she winced. 10. Somebody give me $10 just to take her off my stores. From the dark, shadowed corner near the wood-burning stove, a man stood up. The room grew abruptly quiet. The laughter died in the throats of the frontiersmen as the figure stepped into the light. He was Apache. He wore a mixture of traditional buckskin leggings and a faded, blue cavalry jacket, marking him as a scout, a man who walked between 2 dangerous worlds. His name was Taze. He was tall, his frame lean and corded like hickory, and his face looked as though it had been carved out of the canyon stone itself. His dark eyes were completely unreadable, but they held a cold, piercing intensity that made the armed men near the bar instinctively step back. Taze had come to the post to trade prime beaver pelts for black powder and salt. For the last 20 minutes, he had watched the display with a growing, silent disgust. To his people, a woman was the heart of the camp, she was the keeper of the home, the builder of the wickiup, and a sacred extension of the earth. To see a human being treated like a dying ox, mocked for a condition that was the business of the spirits alone, fouled the air he breathed. He walked past the bar, his moccasins making no sound on the rough pine floor. He stopped at the base of the flour crate, looking up at Sarah. For a brief second, Sarah opened her eyes and looked down. She expected to see the savage bloodlust she had read about in the dime novels back east. Instead, she saw a profound, quiet dignity that terrified her in a completely different way. Taze reached into the pocket of his heavy jacket. He didn't pull a knife or a pistol. Instead, he withdrew a handful of coins, tarnished silver dollars earned from his scouting duties for the territory. He didn't look at Vance. He kept his eyes locked on the floor near Sarah's feet as he tossed the coins onto the crate. They landed with a sharp, metallic ring that echoed in the silent room. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 silver dollars. 7, Taze said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that carried an undeniable authority. It was the only word he spoke. Vance looked at the silver, then at the formidable Apache scout. He knew Taze's reputation. The man was a lethal tracker and could kill a man before he even realized a bow had been drawn. $7 was a pittance, an insult for a human life, but Vance was a coward at heart. He swallowed hard, his greedy fingers quickly sweeping the silver coins off the crate and into his vest pocket. "Sold," Vance muttered, stepping back and wiping the sweat from his neck. "She's your problem now, Apache." Taze reached up, took the frayed hemp rope that Vance had tied around Sarah's wrists, and gave it a gentle but firm tug. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The crowd watched in breathless silence, some with smirks, others with a lingering, uneasy guilt. She stepped down from the crate, her legs trembling so violently she nearly fell. As Taze turned toward the heavy timber doors of the outpost, leading her out into the blinding, unforgiving heat of the desert, Sarah realized her life as a civilized woman was officially over. She had been bought for $7, and she was walking straight into the unknown. The heavy timber doors of the trading post slammed shut behind them, cutting off the smell of whiskey and stale tobacco, replacing it instantly with the dry, searing heat of the Arizona basin. The sun was a blinding white eye in a cloudless sky, baking the earth until the air danced with heat waves. Taze didn't look back. He walked with a long, fluid stride that seemed entirely unbothered by the oppressive temperature, heading straight toward the jagged, red-walled mountains that rose like broken teeth in the distance. In his right hand, he held the end of the hemp rope attached to Sarah's wrists. He didn't pull it taut, he kept just enough slack in the line that she could walk without being dragged, but the message was clear. She was coming with him. Sarah stumbled blindly after him, her leather button boots completely unsuited for the loose shale and cacti of the desert floor. Her mind was a chaotic storm of panic. Every story she had ever heard around the Ohio heath fires, tales of captives tortured, of women traded from band to band, of unspeakable cruelties, rushed to the forefront of her consciousness. This is how it ends, she thought, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Bought for 7 pieces of silver, led into the hills like a goat to the slaughter. For the first 2 hours, the only sounds were the crunch of their footsteps, the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk, and the rhythmic thump of Taze's rifle scabbard against his thigh. He maintained a grueling pace. Sarah's tongue began to swell against the roof of her mouth, dry as ash. The torn shoulder of her calico dress offered no protection, and she could feel the sun blistering her pale skin. Whenever she slowed down, expecting a harsh shout or a violent yank on the rope, Taze merely adjusted his stride, keeping the exact same distance between them. He never spoke. He never even turned around to check on her. It was as if she were a ghost he was dragging behind him. By late afternoon, the terrain began to rise sharply into the foothills. The smooth sand gave way to steep, rocky inclines choked with catclaw mesquite that tore at the hem of Sarah's skirt. Her vision began to blur at the edges, tunneling into a dark, spinning vortex. Her chest burned. "Please," she rasped, the word barely a whisper, catching in her throat. Taze didn't stop. She took 3 more agonizing steps, her boot catching on a jagged piece of quartz. Her knees buckled. She didn't just trip, she collapsed entirely, her body striking the hard earth with a dull thud. The rope yanked tight, pulling her hands forward, but she didn't have the strength to get back up. She rolled onto her side, tucking her chin into her chest, pressing her face into the dirt, waiting for the blows to fall. She was simply too tired to care anymore. Above her, the crunch of footsteps stopped. Sarah closed her eyes tightly, bracing herself. She heard the soft rustle of buckskin and the heavy sigh of a man kneeling in the dirt beside her. A shadow fell over her, blocking out the oppressive sun. Then, she felt something cold and metallic press against the back of her hand. Slowly, tentatively, Sarah opened her eyes. Taze was kneeling on one knee beside her. His face was still a mask of granite, but his dark eyes weren't filled with the malice she expected. Instead, they held a calm, observant patience. In his hand, he held a beaten tin canteen, beaded with condensation. When she didn't move, he reached down with a heavy, calloused hand and wrapped her fingers around the metal flask. Sarah didn't hesitate. Survival instinct overrode her terror. She snatched the canteen, unscrewed the cap with trembling fingers, and brought it to her lips, gulping the lukewarm water greedily. Before she could drink too much and make herself sick, a strong brown hand gently but firmly gripped the base of the canteen, tilting it down away from her mouth. Taze shook his head once, a silent instruction to pace herself. While she caught her breath, Taze did something that shocked her. He reached into his belt, pulled out a small, razor-sharp hunting knife, and leaned toward her. Sarah shrank back, a whimpering cry escaping her throat. But Taze didn't raise the blade. Instead, he slipped the edge of the knife under the hemp rope binding her wrists. With a quick, effortless flick, the fiber parted, falling away into the dirt. He reached out, took her chafed, bleeding wrists in his hands, and briefly inspected the raw skin, his touch surprisingly light, before letting go. The sun was dropping rapidly now, plunging behind the western peaks and casting long, bruised shadows across the canyon. The brutal heat of the desert was instantly replaced by a sharp, creeping chill that made Sarah shiver violently in her thin, torn dress. Without a word, Taze stood up and began gathering dead sagebrush and branches of ironwood. He worked with an efficient, practiced speed. Within minutes, he had constructed a small, tightly packed fire pit between two large boulders that would block the rising wind. He struck a flint, and soon, a small, controlled flame was dancing in the twilight, casting a warm, amber glow over the canyon walls. He gestured with his chin toward the fire, indicating she should move closer. Sarah crept forward on her hands and knees, pulling herself close to the heat, her body shaking from exhaustion and the rapid temperature drop. Taze sat cross-legged on the opposite side of the fire, pulling a piece of dried venison from his pouch. He broke it in half and tossed the larger piece across the flames. It landed in her lap. She looked at the meat, then up at the silent man who had bought her. He was already chewing his own portion, gazing into the fire, completely indifferent to her fear. As the desert night deepened, bringing with it the eerie, echoing cries of a distant coyote pack, Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. She had expected a monster. Instead, she had been given water, fire, and meat by a man who treated her less like a captive and more like a strange, fragile animal he had found injured on the trail. She watched him through the flickering smoke, her terror slowly giving way to a profound, baffling confusion. Part 3, Arrival and Isolation. The morning sun rose cold and sharp over the high country, painting the sandstone cliffs in shades of bruised purple and blood orange. Taze was already on his feet, the fire doused and covered with earth before Sarah's swollen eyes even opened. There was no gentle awakening, he simply stood over her, his shadow blocking the dawn light, and pointed up the narrow canyon trail. By midday, the geography shifted drastically. The barren, cacti-choked flats gave way to juniper-dotted ridges and high, hidden valleys fed by mountain runoff. Tucked into the bend of a rushing, snowmelt creek lay the rancheria, a scattered settlement of traditional domed wickiups woven from willow poles and thatch, interspersed with a few rugged timber cabins. As they entered the perimeter, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the camp. Sarah felt every eye fix upon her. Women scraping deer hides stopped their long, rhythmic strokes, their flint scrapers frozen in midair. Children playing with mud clay scrambled behind their mothers' skirts, peering out at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Old men smoking near the communal fires narrowed their gaze, their faces etched with deep, hostile lines. They did not see a woman, they saw the face of the enemy, the face of the people whose blue-coated soldiers had raided their winter camps and pushed them into the barren rocks. Whispers broke out, sharp and clicking in the Apache tongue. Sarah didn't need to understand the words to feel the venom in them. She shrank inward, trying to make herself as small as possible, expecting someone to throw a stone or spit at her feet. Taze ignored the staring eyes and the low murmurs. He walked with his head held high, leading her past the central fires toward a small, isolated ridge a quarter-mile from the main cluster of dwellings. Nestled against a sheer rock face stood his homestead, a sturdy, low-slung cabin built of pine logs and clay mortar, flanked by a freshly built, smaller wickiup made of green willow branches and clean hide thatch. Taze stopped in the clearing between the two structures. He turned to face her, his expression as unreadable as the mountain stone. He didn't order her inside. He didn't point to the heavy washtubs or the firewood piled by his cabin door. Instead, he reached into his belt, pulled out the bone-handled hunting knife he had used to cut her bonds the night before, and held it out to her, handle first. Sarah gasped, taking a step back, her hands flying to her chest. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please." Taze stepped closer, his dark eyes boring into hers. He took her right hand, lifting it gently but firmly, and pressed the heavy hilt of the knife into her palm, wrapping her fingers around it. He then pointed to the blade, then to her, and made a sharp, outward slashing motion toward the camp below. It was a gesture she understood instantly: defend yourself if anyone comes near. Before she could process the shock of being given a weapon, Taze turned on his heel. He walked to the edge of the clearing and pointed down a narrow, dusty trail that snaked away from the ridge, heading south toward the lowlands, back toward the white settlements and the trading post. He looked back at her, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "Go," he said in heavily accented English, pointing down the trail. Then, he pointed to the small, newly built wickiup behind her. "Or stay." He didn't wait for her answer. He turned, walked into his log cabin, and pulled the heavy blanket door shut behind him, leaving her entirely alone in the clearing. Sarah stood frozen, the heavy iron knife weighing down her right hand. She looked down the long, empty trail leading back to the flats. The sun was hot, the desert below was vast and lethal, and she had no food, no water, and no shoes left to speak of. If she ran, she would die of thirst or be picked up by the same lawless skinners who had mocked her at the outpost. And even if she miraculously made it back to a white settlement, what waited for her? A community that had branded her a useless, barren outcast, a woman with no value. She looked back at the small willow wickiup. Inside, she could see the clean, sweet-smelling pine boughs laid out for a bed, a fresh clay pot filled with clear creek water, and a stack of soft deer hides. She wasn't a prisoner. She wasn't a slave. He had given her a weapon, a roof, and her freedom. With a shaking breath, Sarah lowered the knife to her side. She turned her back on the trail to the white world, walked to the entrance of the small wickiup, and stepped inside. For the first time in weeks, she sank down onto the soft bedding, the knife clutched tightly against her chest, and let the tears finally fall. She was entirely isolated, caught between two worlds, but as the quiet mountain breeze rustled the willow leaves above her, she realized she was no longer a piece of property. He transitioned from a captive state of mind to one of survival did not happen overnight. For the first 2 weeks, Sarah rarely left the immediate perimeter of her small wickiup. She expected the illusion of her freedom to shatter at any moment. But as the scorching summer days bled into one another, she began to realize that the rhythm of life on this isolated ridge was governed by necessity, not cruelty. Every morning, Taze emerged from his cabin at first light. He never called out to her, nor did he order her to prepare his meals. Instead, Sarah watched him through the gaps in her willow branch walls. He would kneel by the creek, wash his face, and then spend hours inspecting his gear, flint-knapping arrowheads, or checking the straps on his pack horse. Slowly, driven by a deep-seated discomfort with idleness, Sarah began to find her own place in the clearing. One afternoon, noticing the water jars by his door were empty, she took the heavy clay pots down to the creek. Her boots had completely fallen apart, so she had wrapped her feet in scraps of buckskin she found left outside her dwelling. When she returned, balancing the heavy jars against her hips, she found Taze sitting by the fire pit, carving a new bow from a piece of supple mountain mahogany. He looked up as she set the water down. For a long moment, his dark eyes evaluated her, taking in her sun-browned skin, her dirt-stained calico dress, and her clumsily wrapped feet. He rose without a word, walked into his cabin, and returned a minute later. He didn't hand her a chore, he handed her a pair of high-topped Apache moccasins, stitched from soft, thick elk hide, along with an awl and a bundle of sinew. He sat back down across the fire, pointed at her feet, and then at the leather. Sarah sat on a smooth stone, her heart racing slightly, and began to work. As she struggled to pierce the tough hide with the bone awl, Taze quietly reached out, took the material from her hands, and demonstrated the correct angle, his large, calloused fingers working with surprising delicacy. "Moccasin," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. It was the first English word he had spoken since offering her the trail. Sarah swallowed, her throat dry. "Moccasin," she repeated. A ghost of a nod passed over his features. From that day on, the silence between them transformed from a wall of fear into a classroom of survival. Taze began taking her past the ridge, into the high valleys where the mountain runoff fed patches of wild flora. He taught her to look past the barren, hostile appearance of the landscape to see the bounty hidden within it. He showed her how to harvest the sweet, starchy hearts of the agave, demonstrating how to roast them in underground pits until they tasted like rich molasses. He pointed out the bright red tunas growing on the prickly pear cacti, using a split stick to deftly pluck them without touching the treacherous spines. "Mezcal," he would say, pointing to the agave. "Mezcal," she would repeat. "And this is a cactus fruit." He would tilt his head, trying out the strange, sharp syllables of her language. "Cicatus." In return, Sarah found ways to make herself indispensable. She took over the mending of his heavy canvas shirts and cavalry jacket, using her fine needlework skills to reinforce the torn seams with sinew. When he brought back a wild turkey or a side of venison, she didn't shrink away from the blood. She watched how the other women in the lower camp dressed the meat, and she copied them, learning to slice the flesh into thin ribbons to dry in the hot wind. One evening, as they sat by the communal hearth fire on the ridge, Sarah looked down at her hands. They were calloused now, stained with berry juice and wood ash, her fingernails cut short. The pale, fragile woman who had been dragged away from the trading post was fading, replaced by someone sturdier. She looked across the flames at Taze, who was quietly sharpening his hunting knife. For the first time, she didn't see a dangerous captor or a strange savage. She saw a disciplined, deeply observant man who moved through the world with an internal peace she had never witnessed in any white man. He did not yell, he did not demand, and he did not look at her with the pity or disgust she had grown so accustomed to. He looked at her as a person, a fellow survivor on a very hard earth. Part 5, Shared Scars. The late summer monsoons arrived with sudden, violent intensity, turning the dry washes into roaring torrents of mud and stone. One evening, a fierce thunderstorm pinned them both inside Taze's log cabin. Outside, the rain lashed against the pine logs, and the wind howled through the canyon like a mourning woman. Inside, the small hearth fire cast a cozy, flickering amber light across the room, smelling of sweet cedar smoke and roasting pinyon nuts. Sarah sat on a thick buffalo robe, her fingers busy repairing a tear in Taze's winter wool blanket. Taze sat opposite her, his long legs crossed, oiling the mechanism of his repeating rifle. The comfortable silence they had built over the weeks felt different tonight, heavier, charged with a quiet contemplation brought on by the storm. Sarah looked up from her sewing, her eyes tracing the deep, jagged scar that ran from Taze's collarbone up to the edge of his jawline, a mark she had often noticed but never dared ask about. As if sensing her gaze, Taze paused his hands. He set the rifle cloth down on his knee and looked across the fire at her. The shadows danced across his rugged face, making him look older, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with physical labor. "Soldiers," Taze said quietly, breaking the silence. He touched the scar on his neck with a thick finger. "Many winters ago. They come in the night. Cold night, like this. Sarah held her breath, lowering the blanket to her lap. Taze looked into the flames, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. Using a mixture of his sparse English, expressive hand gestures, and a few Apache words she had come to understand, he began to paint a picture of his past. He spoke of a wife, Ishkane, whose laughter sounded like the mountain creek, and a little boy who was just learning to track the desert quail. They sleep, Taze murmured, his fist clenching tightly. The blue coats, they shoot the tents. Fire. My woman, my boy. He trailed off, his jaw tight as iron. He made a slashing motion through the air, then pressed his hand flat against his chest, over his heart. Gone into the changing wind. I live. But the heart is ash. A profound wave of empathy washed over Sarah. The terror she had felt toward his people evaporated entirely, replaced by a deep, aching recognition of grief. She knew what it was like to have your entire world violently dismantled, to be left standing in the ruins of a life you thought was safe. Slowly, Sarah reached out, placing her hand near his on the buffalo robe, not quite touching it, offering comfort the only way she knew how. I am so sorry, Taze, she said softly, her voice thick with unshed tears. Taze looked up from the fire, his piercing eyes searching her face. He gestured toward her, an unasked question in his eyes. He knew she had been cast out, traded like a beast of burden, but he did not know the path that had brought her to Silas Vance's trading post. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. She looked down at her own hands, twisting the edge of the calico dress. My people, my husband's family, they threw me away, she began, her voice trembling. She pointed to her stomach, her womb. No children. 3 years, and no babies came. The midwife, she told everyone I was a dry tree. Dead inside. In my world, a woman who cannot have children she is nothing. A broken vessel. My husband died of the pox, and his brother took the farm. They put me on a wagon train and told me never to come back. She wiped a rogue tear from her cheek, the old shame burning in her chest. They said I had no value. That I was a burden to God and man. Taze listened intently, his head tilted slightly. When she finished, he didn't look at her with the pity she dreaded, nor with the disgust her husband's family had shown. Instead, a strange, fierce light sparked in his dark eyes. He leaned forward, reaching across the space between them. For the first time, his large, calloused hand gently touched hers, wrapping his warm fingers around her knuckles. Your people, Taze said, his voice ringing with a deep, absolute certainty, are fools. Sarah blinked, startled by his intensity. Taze shook his head, pointing a thumb toward the lower camp, then back to her. Apache woman is not just a mother of babies. She is the strength of the camp. She finds the water. She keeps the fire. She sees the tracks of the enemy. You. He looked deeply into her eyes, his grip tightening reassuringly. You walk the desert. You do not die. You learn the plants. You fix the clothes. Your mind is sharp like the obsidian blade. You have a warrior's spirit, Sarah. He released her hand and gestured to the room around them. A tree that does not bear fruit still gives shade. It still holds the earth together. You are not a broken vessel. The word struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow. For years, she had been told she was worthless because of a biological flaw she could not control. Yet here, in a log cabin in the middle of a wild, untamed wilderness, a man from a world she had been taught to fear had looked past her trauma and seen her true worth. As the thunder rumbled overhead, fading into the distance, the heavy burden of shame she had carried for years finally slipped off her shoulders. She looked at Taze through a blur of tears, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across her face for the first time in a very long time. They were two broken souls, scarred by different tragedies, but in the quiet safety of the storm, they had found a common ground built on a fierce, mutual respect. The golden warmth of autumn vanished overnight, replaced by a screaming northern wind that swept down from the high peaks, plunging the canyon into a brutal, premature winter. Snow fell in heavy, wet sheets, burying the ridges under 3 feet of treacherous white powder and trapping the rancheria in a freezing vice. On the isolated ridge, the cold was a living entity, clawing at the gaps in the cabin logs. But a far more dangerous threat soon breached their sanctuary. It began with a subtle change in Taze. One evening, he returned from checking his snares, his breath wheezing heavily in his chest. By midnight, he was burning with a violent, terrifying heat. The deep lung fever, a ruthless killer in the high country, had taken hold of him. Sarah woke to the sound of his ragged, hollow coughing. When she rushed to his side of the cabin, she found the formidable hunter shivering violently under his buffalo robes, his eyes glassy and unseeing, his lips tinged with a frightening shade of blue. "Taze," she cried, pressing her hand to his forehead. He felt like a bed of hot coals. He tried to speak, to tell her where the winter medicine was kept, but a fit of hacking coughs racked his lean frame, leaving him weak and gasping for air. Panic seized her. The roles had reversed in a single heartbeat. The man who had been her protector, her teacher, and her anchor was completely incapacitated. If she did nothing, the winter would claim him, and then it would claim her. "You have a warrior's spirit," his words echoed in her mind, cutting through the rising tide of fear. Sarah stood up, her jaw tightening. She threw on her thick buckskin jacket and tied her Apache moccasins tight. She couldn't go down to the lower camp for help, the mountain passes were choked with fresh drifts, and the local families were fiercely protecting their own dwindling fires. She was on her own. First, she rebuilt the hearth fire, stacking the heavy cedar logs until the cabin was filled with a roaring, defensive heat. But heat wasn't enough. She remembered the lessons Taze had taught her during their long walks in the sunlit valleys. "The red willow," she muttered to herself, desperately combing through her memory. "The bark near the water. It cools the blood. It stops the fire in the chest." Armed with Taze's hunting knife, Sarah stepped out into the blinding white storm. The wind screamed down the canyon, ripping at her clothes and freezing the tears on her eyelashes. The snow was up to her thighs, every step an agonizing battle against gravity. She stumbled down the steep, icy slope toward the frozen creek, her hands numb, her lungs burning from the icy air. She found a cluster of red willows half buried near the creek bed. Falling to her knees, her fingers shaking so violently she could barely hold the hilt, she began to hack away at the frozen bark, scraping the inner white fibers into a small canvas pouch. On her way back up the ridge, she spotted a flash of gray in the brush. One of their few milk goats had broken loose from its shelter, shivering and trapped in a snowdrift. Knowing Taze needed nourishment, Sarah grabbed the animal's lead. Dragging herself and the stubborn animal up the slick, steep incline through sheer, unadulterated willpower, she finally kicked the cabin door shut behind her. She didn't stop to rest. She boiled the willow bark in a tin pot over the hearth, filling the cabin with a bitter, medicinal steam. She milked the goat, warming the rich liquid over the flames. For 3 agonizing days and nights, Sarah did not sleep. She became a machine of pure survival. She bathed Taze's chest with cool melted snow to break the fever, gently lifted his heavy head to force the bitter willow tea down his throat, and spooned warm goat's milk past his cracked lips. When his shivering grew so violent that the buffalo robes weren't enough, she climbed into the bed beside him, wrapping her own body around his, using her own warmth to keep his heart beating. On the 4th morning, the storm finally broke, leaving behind a vast, silent world of glittering white. Inside the cabin, the fire had settled into a quiet, steady hum. Sarah sat on the floor, her back against the bed frame, her eyes heavy with dark circles of exhaustion. A soft rustle of blankets broke the silence. Slowly, Sarah looked up. Taze's eyes were open. They were no longer glassy with fever, they were clear, dark, and completely focused on her. His skin was cool, and his breathing, though shallow, was rhythmic and free of the terrifying rattle. He looked around the cabin, noting the neatly stacked firewood, the pot of willow tea, and the quiet goat resting in the corner. Finally, his gaze settled back on Sarah. He looked at her tangled hair, her soot-stained face, and the raw, blistered skin on her hands from the freezing wind. He didn't speak. He slowly reached out from beneath the heavy robes, his large hand trembling slightly from weakness, and placed his palm flat against her cheek. His thumb gently wiped away a smudge of wood ash. There were no words spoken in English or Apache, but as Sarah pressed her cheek into his warm palm, she knew she had passed the ultimate trial. She had not just survived the desert, she had conquered the winter. She was no longer a stranger living on his ridge, she was the reason he was alive. The arrival of spring was a violent awakening. The thick mountain snows melted into rushing torrents, filling the valleys with the scent of wet earth and wild clover. Life returned to the ridge, but with the open trails came a danger Sarah had almost forgotten existed, the world she had left behind. It happened on a crisp morning while Taze was down by the creek mending a fish weir. Sarah was outside the cabin, hanging a heavy wool blanket over a pine branch to air out, when the sharp, unnatural clink of shod horses against stone echoed up the trail. Before she could drop the blanket, 3 men rode into the clearing. They were hard-faced, filthy, and heavily armed. Leading them was a man Sarah recognized instantly with a jolt of pure dread, Luke Miller, a notorious bounty hunter and tracker who frequented Silas Vance's trading post. He reined in his buckskin horse, his yellowed teeth baring in a cruel, victorious grin as his eyes locked onto her. "Well, I'll be damned," Miller scoffed, tipping his greasy hat. "The boys back at Bitter Creek said a savage bought a white woman for a handful of silver, but I had to see it to believe it. Look at you, Sarah. You're plumb turned Indian." The 2 men behind him laughed, their hands resting loosely near the holsters of their pistols. "We're here to rescue you, ma'am," one of the men said, his eyes scanning her form with an unsettling greed. "There's a handsome reward out for any captives brought back to the territory line. Move out of the way so we can dispatch the thief." Sarah stood frozen for a fraction of a second. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but it wasn't the submissive fear of the woman on the flour crate. It was a cold, calculated fury. She looked at these men, their sneering faces, their total lack of respect, the casual brutality they carried like a badge of honor. They hadn't come to rescue her, they had come to harvest her like a bounty crop and murder the man who had given her a life. "I don't need rescuing," Sarah said, her voice steady, ringing clearly across the clearing. "I am not a captive. Turn your horses around and leave this ridge." Miller's grin vanished, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You've gone soft in the head, woman. You've been broken by M. We ain't leaving without you, and we sure as hell ain't leaving an Apache alive." He reached down, his fingers wrapping around the stock of his rifle. Before Miller could clear his scabbard, a shadow exploded from the brush at the edge of the clearing. Taze moved like a striking sidewinder. He tackled the second rider clean off his horse, both men hitting the hard earth in a tangle of limbs. A pistol discharged wildly into the air, scaring the horses into a frenzy. "Kill him!" Miller screamed, trying to wheel his horse around to get a clear shot at Taze, who was already locked in a lethal hand-to-hand struggle with the second bounty hunter. Sarah didn't hesitate. She didn't scream, and she didn't run into the woods to hide. She lunged inside the cabin door, her hands instinctively grabbing the heavy repeating rifle Taze had taught her to load, clean, and shoot during the long winter nights. She stepped back out into the blinding sunlight, throwing the rifle to her shoulder. She racked the lever with a sharp, mechanical clack-clack that drew the immediate attention of the third rider, who was raising his pistol toward Taze. "Drop it!" Sarah roared. The third man spun his horse toward her, his face twisting in shock as he looked down the barrel of a Winchester held by a woman in buckskin moccasins. He hesitated for a split second, adjusting his aim toward her. Bang! Sarah pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder, the black powder smoke momentarily blinding her. Her shot struck the rider's shoulder, spinning him cleanly out of his saddle. He hit the dirt, groaning and clutching his bleeding arm, his pistol clattering away into the rocks. Miller turned, his face pale with disbelief. He found himself trapped. On the ground, Taze had completely incapacitated the second hunter, his hunting knife pressed firmly against the man's throat. And 10 yards away stood Sarah, already racking another round into the chamber, her eyes locked onto Miller's chest with absolute, lethal focus. "I told you to leave," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper, the rifle completely steady in her hands. "The next one goes through your heart." Miller looked at Taze, whose dark eyes promised a slow death, and then at Sarah, who looked entirely prepared to pull the trigger. The bounty hunter realized the terrifying truth: he wasn't dealing with a victim and a captor. He was dealing with a united front. 2 predators defending their home. "All right. All right, damn it!" Miller yelled, slowly raising his hands. "Don't shoot. Get your men, get on your horses, and never look back," Sarah commanded, gesturing with the barrel of the gun. With frantic haste, Miller helped his wounded companions back into their saddles. They didn't say another word. They spurred their horses, tearing down the mountain trail in a cloud of dust, terrified of the woman they had come to save. As the dust settled, the silence returned to the ridge. Sarah slowly lowered the rifle, her chest heaving as the adrenaline began to fade. Taze stood up, dusting the red dirt from his leather leggings. He didn't look at the trail where the men had fled. He walked straight over to Sarah. He took the heavy rifle from her hands, leaning it against the cabin wall, and then did something he had never done before. He reached out and placed both of his large, warm hands on her shoulders, looking down into her eyes with a mixture of fierce pride and profound reverence. He didn't need to speak. The man who had bought her for $7 out of a sense of basic human decency now looked at her as his absolute equal, a defender of their sanctuary, and a true woman of the Apache Hills. The violent echo of the bounty hunter's retreat eventually faded into the vast canyon below, replaced by the gentle, rhythmic rustle of the spring wine through the budding cottonwood trees. The ridge was quiet again, but the air felt lighter, cleansed of the lingering ghosts of Sarah's past. A week after the confrontation, a small delegation from the lower rancheria climbed the steep trail to Taze's homestead. Leading them was Chus, an elder whose face was a map of deep wrinkles, his hair as white as the winter snows. Behind him walked several women carrying baskets of ground mesquite meal, dried venison, and intricately woven blankets. Sarah stood beside Taze in the clearing, her heart giving a nervous flutter. She still remembered the cold, hostile stares that had greeted her arrival nearly a year ago. Chus stopped a few paces away. He looked at Taze, nodding in respect, and then turned his old, wise eyes toward Sarah. He looked at her sun-darkened skin, the callus on her rifle finger, and the soft elk-hide moccasins on her feet. Word of her defense of the ridge, of how she had stood shoulder to shoulder with an Apache warrior and bled a white predator to protect their home, had spread like wildfire through the camp. The old man stepped forward, bypassing Taze entirely. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a necklace made of polished turquoise and silver beads. With slow, deliberate movements, he placed it around Sarah's neck. "Guzu," Chus murmured, a rare, warm smile breaking through his weathered features. He spoke a phrase in his native tongue, then looked to Taze to translate. Taze looked down at Sarah, his chest swelling with visible pride. "He says, the mountain spirits do not see the color of the skin. They see the strength of the heart. He says you are no longer a stranger to the people. You are Nalin, the one who stands firm." The women stepped forward, offering their baskets, their previous hostility replaced by soft, welcoming smiles and gentle touches on Sarah's arms. For the first time since she had been cast out of the wagon train, Sarah felt the deep, anchoring warmth of a community. She was no longer a burden, an outcast, or a piece of defective property. She was accepted. She was valued. That evening, after the elders had returned to the lower valley, the camp below erupted into a vibrant celebration. The rhythmic, hypnotic thud of the social drums echoed up the canyon walls, accompanied by the rising smoke of great bonfires and the joyous songs of a people who had survived another long winter. On the ridge, Taze and Sarah stood at the edge of the overlook, watching the distant orange glow of the celebration. The spring night was cool, but a deep, comforting warmth settled between them. Taze turned to her, reaching into his pocket. When he pulled his hand out, he opened his palm. Resting in his calloused skin were 7 tarnished silver dollars, the exact coins he had used to buy her freedom at the Bitter Creek trading post. He had retrieved them from Silas Vance's till weeks after the trade, keeping them as a reminder. Sarah looked at the coins, a soft smile playing on her lips. "The $7 bride," she whispered, a gentle chuckle escaping her throat. Taze shook his head, his dark eyes melting with a profound, fierce tenderness. He took her hand, pressing the silver coins into her palm, wrapping his fingers over hers. "No," Taze said, his voice a low, beautiful rumble that vibrated in her very soul. "Not a bride bought. A spirit found." He pulled her gently against his chest, and Sarah didn't pull away. She leaned into his strength, resting her head against his shoulder as they looked out over the vast, wild territory. The world below them was still dangerous, still changing, and entirely unpredictable. But as she clutched the silver coins in her hand and felt the heartbeat of the man beside her, Sarah knew she was finally home. The woman who had been discarded as a dry, dead tree had found her roots in the high desert, blooming into something fiercer, stronger, and more beautiful than she had ever dared to dream.